and carbon-based fuel is the most efficient source of energy.
Hold on a second. Ring, ring. Angela Merkel. Oh, it's for you. She says that's bullshit.
Devil's Advocate
with Skyler Turden. All right, thanks. I'm glad to be with you. Last installment we did with Jordan Peterson. A lot of feedback. People really enjoyed it. Wanted to get some more prominent conservatives on the show just to talk about, most pressing issues. So the most requested person was our next guest, and the topic we'll be discussing today here on Devil's Advocate is basically the merits and the drawbacks of socialism. He's the host of the Benjamin Shapiro program on the Daily Caller. Thanks for your time, Benjamin.
Absolutely, Skyler Turden.
Well, thank you for. I do appreciate you being here. So obviously, we'll be talking about socialism here. Something that's very popular at your shows, where you do a lot of Q&As, and you're very popular in conservative circles, in far-right circles, and alt-right circles. And I've heard a lot of this. Socialism is evil. Socialism is theft. I want to know why you believe that to be the case. I've heard you talk about it because obviously, in principle. Would we agree that in principle it's good? And Old Testament talks a lot about not oppressing the poor, giving to the poor. Often the rich are portrayed as villains because of their greed. So as a descendant of the Jewish people and faith, would we not agree that helping the poorest among us is a moral mission? Sure.
That's called charity. But what is not moral is stealing money from me to give to somebody else on the part of a government that points a gun at me. That's not an actual thing. And the Bible doesn't talk about that in any way. The Bible, if we want to talk about the biblical dictates with regard to charity,
yeah.
There's, and we can do it in Hebrew. There's Maser, there's Maser Sheni, there's Truma, there's Peh and Leket. There's a bunch of different aspects of Jewish law that talk about charity, but they are all relegated to the realm of private charity, meaning that it's more about my obligation to give charity and less about your rights to my money. So we're supposed to recognize that wealth belongs to God, but my wealth does not belong to you in the biblical view.
Sure. Well, I was using it more as a moral, using it as a moral beam. I don't really want to get off on sort of the metaphysical and God and that kind of. I didn't want to get into God's definition of what's necessarily moral, but the idea that as a society, it's moral to help the poorest among us, especially when we look at systemic, oppression of the poor, as we see. We're not just talking about a level playing field, right? We're talking about a playing field where the middle class is shrunken dramatically. We're talking about, wages have not kept up with inflation. The rich keep getting richer. That gap keeps widening. So there's a system in place, which to me,
none of that's true. None of that's actually true is the problem. So actually, the middle class in the United States. The upper middle class was about 12% of the population of the United States in 1979, and by 2014, that was 30% of the American population. So the disappearance of the middle class folks talk about is really the middle class becoming upper middle class, and the standard of living for everyone in the United States has risen dramatically since 1979. One of the favorite statistics folks like to cite here is they say that there's been wage stagnation in hourly wages since 1979, adjusted for inflation. Well, that's true. It also doesn't take into account any of the benefits.
Hold on a second. Not entirely, obviously, because of minimum wage laws, which we'll get to in a bit.
Well, the fact is, we can do that in a second, but the fact is that the wage stagnation that has taken place does not take into account additional benefits, which is 30 to 40% on top of the salary. It doesn't take into account the different way that we count households than we used to. It also doesn't take into account the fact that you can get more stuff for the same inflation-adjusted dollar than you could in 1979. You have a nicer fridge now than you did in 1979, and it costs you basically half of what it would have in 1979 in inflation-adjusted dollars. So if you're getting twice as much stuff for the same buck now, that means that you're basically twice as rich as you would have been in 1979. And for anyone who disagrees, I would recommend you go back to 1979 and live in 1979 and see whether your standard of living is the same, whether you enjoy it.
Well, now we're getting back into the meta-economist Benjamin Shapiro. If we all have a time-traveling machine, let's try and keep it in reality. Like you say, facts. Facts don't care about your time-traveling machine. What about homes? What about homes? What about retirement? The middle-class family today has much more difficulty affording a home. If you go back to the 50s, you could live in a single-income household and have a vehicle, have a home, retire at a reasonable age. That's not the case now. Who really cares if you have, a Frigidaire in your kitchen?
Well, a couple of things about this. One, homes in the United States have radically increased in size over time. So homes back in the 1950s, and you can see this when you go check them out, much smaller than the homes that are being built now. Two, the increase in home prices is really because of this massive urbanization that's happened where people are rushing into massive cities, and these cities are heavily zoned. So that's created an incredible shortage of housing in major liberal cities. You're not seeing the same sort of housing shortages in places that don't have those same sort of zoning regulations, places like Dallas, places in the middle of the country. You're mostly seeing it in Seattle, LA, San Francisco, New York, places where it's difficult to build new buildings and where the government has mandated that you also build affordable housing, taxed you heavily, created new regulations.
Right. That's
what's creating a serious pressure in that sphere.
Right. So it's the government's fault. I just want to make sure I have this right. So it's the government's fault that people cannot afford homes. It's the government's fault that that the wage gap is actually increasing, that the middle class is shrinking. I know you say it's not, but we've look at the 1% who are wealthier than ever before, and the rest of the population, right?
Well, no, the wealth gap, the fact that there is a greater disparity between the top tax bracket and the bottom tax bracket is true, but the bottom tax bracket is a lot richer than it used to be. And again, one of the things that is a huge mistake folks make when it comes to analyzing economic issues is the suggestion that if you are in the top 1%, you are always in the top 1%. You started there, you finished there, you lived there, you died there. There are people, I've been in the top 1%, I've been not in the top 1%. People tend to get wealthier as they get older, and so the upper tax brackets are disproportionately older than the lower tax brackets. Again, that movement is suggestive of the fact that folks are earning more and less over the course of their lifetime. It's not just like that there's this ingrown caste of people who are born rich and stay rich. Inherited wealth accounts for very little of the top tax brackets.
Yeah, well, you know, I've heard this talked about a lot, sort of class mobility is how I think it's often referred to. But I've noticed a theme. You talk about going back to 1979. You talk about how these people will be wealthier down the line as they get older. Again, we're kind of in the realm of meta-economics, right? Things that you feel will happen down the line. But that's not what's happening with these people right now when you're talking about these people today in 2018 who can't afford to go to college, who can't afford to purchase a home, who can't afford health insurance, right? If Benjamin Shapiro of the Daily Callers, if his ideal world works out, down the line, these people will be great. They'll be the next Kochs or whatever. But today, that's not the case.
Well, no, if my ideal world worked out, what you'd have is lower prices and better products in virtually every area of American life, from healthcare to colleges. The fact is the government subsidies are one of the areas that's creating upward pressure in prices. When you give a bunch of people subsidies to go to college, what you're doing is generating additional supply or additional demand without additional supply. That creates upward pricing pressure. I mean, this is a simple supply-demand curve. And the fact that folks on the left don't seem to understand this, they think that if you just dump a bunch of money into free college education, that this is going to somehow alleviate all of the economic woes of a society that is already absorbing the cost of a bunch of college graduates who can't get jobs because they majored in silly things. It's a little bit bewildering. And in fact, it's really interesting. A lot of the socialist countries that socialists like to talk about, the quote-unquote socialist countries of Scandinavia, they have a lot more heavily regimented idea of what colleges should be for. I mean, if you look at Sweden, if you look at Switzerland, there's a lot more tracking. People who are going to colleges or vocational schools based on the vocation they wish to pursue. Liberal arts majors in Scandinavia, significantly less of the college population than in the United States, because they feel like if they're going to get the government to sponsor college degrees, at least you should come out with some marketable skills. Okay, so it's interesting that you point to a lot of these Scandinavian countries. You know, we talk about that on my program quite a bit, Denmark, Sweden, Norway. So it sounds like you'd be okay with sort of moving toward maybe the more socialist model that they use in those countries that are really quite successful. We've heard, obviously, Senator Sanders and people like Cortez talking about this. A lot of people said there are no successful socialist countries. I would point to almost all those Scandinavian countries. Well, I mean, and this has become the favorite the kind of favorite tool of quote-unquote socialists today is to pick countries that have built their entire wealth base on capitalism and then have placed on top of that capitalism some redistributionist systems and then call those countries socialist. That's not a socialist country. A socialist country is a country that uses abolition of profit as a tool and nationalization of property as a chief tool and public ownership of the means of production as the chief tool of wealth production and distribution. That's not actually what happens in Denmark or Norway or Switzerland or Sweden or any of these countries, which is why the Prime Minister of Denmark suggested back in 2015, when Bernie Sanders kept jabbering about Denmark being a socialist country, he went to Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He said, we're not a socialist country, or a capitalist country. All of these supposedly socialist countries rank around or higher than the United States in the Heritage Foundation Economic Freedom Index than the United States does, which would suggest that these are not actually countries that are focused sincerely on regulation of business above all and redistribution of property through the means of production.
Well, if I may jump in there, I think it's important that we, the Economic Freedom Index, like we're talking about there, Canada was higher than the United States for a little longer, even though they have a universal health care plan. So it sounds to me like you're okay with sort of the model that we see, the Nordic model. So then would we be okay with a universal health care program or a single payer? Because if you look at these countries that you just said, right, are not socialist. But then if we try and implement it here in the United States, people say, oh, that's socialized healthcare. Universal healthcare, single payer model.
Is socialist, right? So the program can be socialist, but the question of calling the entire country socialist because it has a socialist program in medicine, that's a little bit silly. I mean, that's like suggesting that you who have a job and you bring home money to your family and then you redistribute the money among members of your family. You have a joint bank account with your wife. This means you're a socialist. No, you're a capitalist who uses socialist methods of redistribution in your own home. It's the same thing with Norway or Denmark. And then we have to look at the efficacy of those programs. We also have to look at the rights of the people that are being violated by those programs. Do you have a right to your own use of labor? Do you have a right to the product of your labor? Do you have a right to the alienation of your labor? And then we also have to look at whether any of those, even if you believed that it didn't violate rights, you'd have to look at whether those programs were adaptable to the United States, which typically they have not been, because the reality is that in places like Sweden or Norway or Switzerland, what you have, particularly in places like Norway, is a really, really high level of cultural homogeneity. You know, a high level of social capital that exists, that doesn't exist in the United States in quite the same way.
So it's the blacks' fault. I just want to make sure. That's what it's the fault of the blacks.
No, it is the fault of cultures that are not
homogeneously that's right. It's not race, it's culture. That's right. I forgot what the alt-right. That's the same. I mean,
ask the Norwegians. Ask the Norwegians who have significantly curtailed immigration from the Islamic world, specifically because they're having problems of cultural assimilation.
I probably would have a really good conversation because they have a higher literacy rate. They have more public education there, and of course their populace is generally healthier because they have socialized healthcare and they spend less on healthcare.
Well, their population is healthier and has been healthier for decades because they don't eat as much crap as Americans do. Virtually all wealth generation that happened in the Nordic countries preceded the socialist redistribution systems that people like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Ocasio-Cortez love. Norway was actually ranked higher in terms of relative health to the United States in the 1960s and 70s than it is now. And that's because, again, these are countries with very high levels of social capital, a tremendous work ethic, a certain level of egalitarianism between men and women that goes back generations, that was not established by radical feminism. And what you've seen is actually a lot of difficulty in assimilating immigrants in Nordic countries. There's a great book called Debunking Utopia by Nima Sanandaji that's totally worth reading on this. He's an actual Iranian immigrant to Norway, and he talks specifically about the shortcomings of immigration in these places. It turns out that it's much easier to become employed as an immigrant in the United States than it is in Nordic countries.
Yeah, well, they also do have better healthcare outcomes overall, with a lower percentage of their GDP being spent per average person. So I would say that's also pretty important. Let me ask you this.
Well, listen, the United States healthcare system is a disaster area, but that's largely to do with
let me guess, the government of the blacks,
of regulation.
Right? You're going to blame the government of the blacks?
Of course. Yeah. No, not the blacks.
Okay.
The blacks. It's not about any particular race, obviously. It's about a mishmash of regulation and deregulation that has created some of the worst of all possible worlds, although the United States still leads the world when it comes to 5-year cancer survival rates, for example. So if you can afford health care in the United States, it's still the best health care in the world.
Benjamin Shapiro of Daily Caller. Are you a Nazi? Okay, we can move on. So I've read that you have made the claim that capitalism is like consensual sex, socialism is rape. And the one thing I think that's interesting right now that we're talking about is sort of where the line is. First of all, I disagree if it's democratic socialism when we're talking about the public consenting by a vote. And I understand what you're going to say. Not everyone goes along with it, but that's true of any law passed, right, democratically. We have all kinds of, you'll never get 100% of people to agree on a law. But in this case, when we're talking about socialism versus capitalism, do we really think that's a fair comparison, that it's like consensual sex versus rape? And where do you draw the line? I mean, it seems to me like you enjoy some social programs. Some socialism's okay. you use public roads, if I'm not mistaken, you don't have a problem with that.
Public roads are the public roads and public goods generally are non-rivalrous and non-excludable. That's what makes them public goods. So it's not quite the same thing, right? Now you're talking about everybody's access to a road that anyone can use, and I can't exclude you from use of that road in the same way that the military is non-rivalrous and non-excludable. That's the definition of a public good. That's not the same thing as alienation of my labor. So the question really is your rights. When it comes to sex, you have the right to consent or not to consent. Mm-hmm. When it comes to how I use my labor, I have the right to consent or not to consent. And you voting to remove my right to consent or not to consent does not alienate the right. It just means that you're violating it.
That's interesting that you bring that up, or you're talking about the right to work. But what about the right, for example, of people who are working to be in healthy conditions, to be in at least humane conditions? Are these laws that you support? Workers' rights? No, we're not even getting into unionization or collective bargaining.
Well, I like collective bargaining better than, in fact, if you want to use these favored socialist countries as examples,
yeah.
Places like Denmark and Norway have much more use of collective bargaining by unions for work conditions than they have regulation from the top down, because that allows the workers to actually negotiate with the employers on what work conditions should look like. I don't have a problem with private unions getting together, collectivizing, and then negotiating with management. But I'm not a big fan of the idea of a top-down cram down that happens from a government entity that rarely knows how a business runs and, again, prevents people from actually using their labor as they see fit.
Just not when it's public roads, police, or military. Got it. I just want to make sure that I'm clear.
Again, non-rivalrous, non-excludable goods.
Well, let's talk about that non-rivalrous, non-excludable. College, then. That's a great example. You have rising tuition
that is both
costs
rivalrous
across
and
the board. If you have a classroom of 30 people, let's say 8 years ago when it was 20,000 a semester. Today that could be as high as 35,000 a semester. If you look at the rates, the inflation, you look at how much college loans cost. Still 30 people in that classroom. You're not talking about adding more people at that point. So we could apply a lot of these rules as far as non-rivalrous, non-excludable.
No,
why not college?
The use of a college, because the use of professors does prevent other people from using the professors. Professors do not have an unlimited number of people that they can teach. They have time commitments. They have to grade papers. There are only so many hours in the day. Mm-hmm. That is, by nature, rivalrous. And it is also excludable in the sense that if you don't pay for the college, you don't have a right to use the college. That's not the same thing as a road where anyone can use the road and there's not a police officer there. It's not like a toll road. Police officer's not there to prevent you from actually using the road. The same thing is certainly not true of a college campus. If you walked into a college campus today without paying tuition, sat down and started taking classes, then you would quickly be removed.
No, I can tell that doesn't happen. I do it all. I sit in on classes all the time, and I do not get removed. And you know what? I'm very grateful for professors who are open-minded enough to allow people to go in and learn, because I think they're the heroes of our country, teachers of all ages, of all stripes, and they don't get appreciated enough. When we're talking about, like we said, 30 people in a classroom, what about a limited amount of pupil? Let's say colleges. Can we just set a certain amount of colleges and say, okay, this is the sign-up sheet? After this, we're fill up, so it becomes non-rivalrous, non-excludable. Not all colleges, but could we do that and make that entirely?
Well, I'm not sure why. I'm not sure. Well, now you're actually limiting the supply. So what you'd actually want to do is have a free market system where supply meets demand, where there are a number of people who want to go to college, and now you have people competing for that dollar without federal subsidies to major in stupid things, and then you can get a loan. I mean, I had no problem getting a law school loan. My wife had no problem getting a medical school loan, because these are actual careers that you can pay back the money. You are going to have a little bit more of a problem if you're a gender studies major and you want to get a loan for a gender studies major from a bank. There's no collateral, and the chances of you getting a job outside of a gender studies professoriate are pretty low.
You're practicing law today, Ben?
I haven't for a while, actually. There's a guy I think, Steven Crowder. I used to practice law for him for a little while, but he turned out to be just an awful client, so I moved out of the law.
I was going to say, it turns out that was a really useful degree, right? While we're throwing jabs out there. I think that you're not being honest when you make it seem as though the only people who can't afford college are people who are taking these, these more sort of niche degrees. There are plenty of people out there who are in applied sciences who can't afford school. We don't know, right? That's the thing. If we're going to talk about placing a priority as a society, because we all have values, right, it would seem to me that it'd be better spent on education, healthcare than the military-industrial complex. That's okay, different strokes. So what about public schools? Right, they're definitely rivalrous, excludable. Don't fit the definition of public goods. Would Benjamin Shapiro of Daily Caller just completely abolish public education if you had your way?
Now, I have some severe questions about whether we should actually be utilizing public education as opposed to local private schools and parochial schools. So I think the public school system has turned out to be, in large measure, a disaster. I also do think that there's a difference between a small community deciding that they want to put together a local school and the federal government cramming down on people across the nation what exactly federal standards should be. Because again, the levels of agreement inside a small, cohesive community are a lot higher than they are across a country of 330 million people with diverse viewpoints and cultures and decisions to make about education.
Okay, so I think you didn't really answer my question. What would you do with public schools? Yeah, your choice. You get rid. So should we not have a federal Department of Education? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, we should abolish the federal. Yes, we should abolish the federal Department of Education. Yes.
Why? And why is that exactly?
Because it doesn't do anything and it's garbage. because the standards.
I'll be sure to look that study up on PubMed afterwards.
At every level,
The Economist,
except for colleges.
Yeah.
Look, what's fascinating in the United States is if you actually look at the best schools in the United States, they are all at the upper level where supply and demand dictate the quality of the education. America's college system is a very, very good college system by any global measure. America's high school and junior high and elementary school systems are by and large not, and the only good elementary and junior high and middle school and high schools are the ones that exist in communities that spend not only more resources but have parents who are usually dedicated to high levels of education in their children, regardless of income.
Right. So this is where we avoid. We say cultural, right? We don't want to actually say like Jewish families and Asian families and not the blacks, right? That's what's going on. Okay, I got you. So let me ask this. It sounds so. You think all schools should be private, basically K through 12, college? That's it. Is that your solution?
I think that would be a good start.
Okay.
I think that if you are going to have a public school system, then it should be as minimal as possible, and it should be designed at the local level. And again, I think local communities deciding what they want is a lot better than massive communities deciding what they want. I sort of abide by Montesquieu's rules on this. The devolution of authority to the lowest possible level is the best way of achieving any sort of consensus.
Well, that brings me, it's interesting enough, that brings me to my next point. You just talked about how smaller communities are the people who should be building schools from the ground up. Okay, so we privatize all schools, right? We don't have any public school, no longer K through 12 or college.
But you can have public schools, but the public schools have to be done at the local level where the level of consensus is a lot higher than across the country.
Okay. So we're talking about communities where they have consensus, and you just said that they perform higher in certain communities, right? Communities with families, right? Maybe dads who stay in the house, but we don't want to get into the racial stuff. What about kids whose parents can't afford to send them to school? We're talking about those private schools. Or they're in a community where they don't have a community to have the resources for it. So they're deprived of an education because of their parents' poverty. And that brings us back to, isn't that, again, what we see, a system that perpetually keeps the rich rich and the poor poor, especially if we're starting with grade school education?
Well, number one, this is one of the beautiful things about religious education in particular, is that the amount of charity that exists in private school systems for people who are going to religious schools, extraordinarily high. It is also true that when it comes to people who don't have opportunities available for their kids, we need folks making responsible decisions about how to raise their children and whether to bear those children in the first place, whether to get pregnant in the first place. But if a parent isn't able to take care of their kids, usually if you're not willing to do what you need to do to educate your kid, then we ought to talk about whether you should be in control of that child in the first place.
Yeah. Ben Shapiro, Daily Caller, advocate for eugenics, apparently now. That's where we've gone. So what we're talking about, this is a school, and we're talking about the economy and capitalism versus socialism, grade school education. Sounds to me like you're okay with a system that, like we just talked about, sort of keeps the poor poor and the rich rich. Here's the thing. We're talking about the 1% as a number that's thrown around. I know people don't like to talk about the 1%, but big corporations, right? They make their money while we're talking about systemic oppression, and I think education will factor into that. This is capitalism versus socialism. I've heard your argument, morally speaking. They make their money off of exploiting those at the bottom of the economy. To me, that's nonsensically outrageous and immoral. If we're comparing two economic systems, one that says, all right, we have to place priority, we have to determine what we value as a society, education, healthcare, or one that says we have to determine what we value as a society, the ability for the wealthiest people in the world to get wealthier at the expense of others. It sounds to me like that's what you're advocating. Privatized schools.
I'd like to know how the wealthiest people in the world get wealthy at the expense of poor people who have no money in the first place. particularly when you see that statistically, literally half the world's population has been raised out of poverty since 1980, specifically because of free markets, capitalism, and private property rights.
Yeah, well, this is the problem with the alt-right and the right wing today. It's this autistic view of the world, and that, you know, if you have an iPhone, fine, you don't have to worry about it anymore, right? Technology's got, like I'm saying, that's not what really matters. I'm talking about people, you know, get out in the street, right? Talk with these people, see how people are living in the United States. I don't think you understand the point. It's not about how much money the poor have. I'm not saying that the rich are mugging them in an alleyway. They're not getting rich off of the poor's money. They're getting rich off of exploiting their labor. Right? This is because the rich own the means, since the Industrial Revolution, they own the means of production. So we don't want that to go to the government, but we want it to be in the hands of a few people who get billion-dollar bonuses, while the poor can't even get a living wage of $15 an hour. These same people lobby the government to make sure they make $7 an hour less.
The poorest people on planet Earth live in one of two systems. Either a system that does not guarantee private property ownership because there is no actual governmental system to guarantee private property ownership, or two, a system where private property ownership does not exist and the government owns the means of production and does not operate in even state capitalistic fashion, but operates for the quote-unquote good of the workers. When that happens, poor people emerge. This is what's happened in Venezuela, that's what happened in the USSR, it's what happened in Cuba, it's what happened in North Korea, or alternatively, it's what happened in places like Somalia or Sudan. So again, the idea that rich people are somehow exploiting labor, unless you can show how they're doing so by pointing a gun at somebody or using another government gun to point at somebody, free alienation of labor is a fundamental human right. Your decision to work for a given wage is your decision, and no one's forcing you into it.
Oh, come on.
Nobody's forcing you into it.
Again, it goes back to this. It's this simplistic, reductive, you know, on the spectrum view of how the world works. We're not just talking about how much money people have in their pocket. We're talking about a system right now that doesn't, frankly, allow poor people to become the next Polk brother or the Walton family. You know, Walmart is probably one of the biggest recipients of welfare in the country because they don't even pay their people a living wage. See, I mean, we're talking about capitalism. It's totally cool to bail out banks. It's totally cool to make sure that oil companies get subsidies. But once we cross the line into education, man, that's where we draw the line, and you're on your own,
bro.
That's
not capitalism. That's not capitalism. Subsidies to Walmart is not capitalism. That's state-sponsored mercantilism, essentially. It's really closer to economic fascism. And I agree that Walmart would be actually forced by the labor market to pay its workers more if you did not have the government picking up the food stamps on the other end. That is a supplementation of wages by the federal government toward businesses like Walmart. I don't believe that big businesses should be receiving subsidies from the federal government any more than I believe that individuals generally should be receiving subsidies from government.
So, okay. So if welfare just didn't exist, if EBT cards just didn't exist, Walmart would pay $15 an hour. Is that a fact, Mr. Meta Economist?
Well, right. they would, in fact, have to raise their wages because people cannot work for a non-living wage or they would be dead by definition.
Do you think Walmart cares if you die in a gutter? Think Walmart gives rats? They don't care.
If they can't get you to work, I mean, if they got no one to stock the shelves because you're dead in a gutter, I do think Walmart cares.
Yeah, I don't think they care. I think they automate, and this is a problem we see now with new technology. Listen, there aren't the same kind of jobs for people. Not everyone's going to be a Harvard lawyer. Not everyone's going to be a Harvard lawyer's wife/doctor, right? Some people actually have to go out there and work on the assembly line and make the nice things that you enjoy. But that becomes automated, and these people get left behind, right? That's a problem.
We have 7 million unfilled jobs in the United States right now. 7 million unfilled jobs in the United States right now, and essentially record low unemployment. So I'm failing to see the millions of people who are desperately missing a job, other than folks who probably should move out of communities where factories died 25 years ago.
Oh, yeah. So that's their solution. Just, hey, move. It's not my problem.
Pretty much.
Really?
Yep. Well, no, the fact is that America was built by people who were moving. Right? America was built by folks who crossed an ocean and left behind property ownership and family to build a new life, and then it was built by people who crossed the Appalachians to go and stake out claims in the middle of nowhere and try to build a farm at risk of death. So yes, I think that you driving 20 miles down the turnpike to get a job fracking as opposed to being in a town where there are no jobs is probably a worthwhile endeavor.
So there we go to fracking. And you don't think it's a moral imperative to make sure that we deliver a world that our children can inherit? You just saw the recent...
Fracking is significantly less damaging to the environment than any other form of drilling, and natural gas is significantly better for the environment than a variety of other forms of carbon-based fuel.
Yeah, but what about solar? What about wind? What about doing what Germany's done? Those are, the only options aren't
nuclear
natural
power?
gas or
I mean,
oil.
like-
Yeah, solar, wind
Well, no,
power.
nuclear power powers all of France, so we could do that. But people on the left don't like nuclear power because they are scared of things that really have not happened historically.
Yeah, because Chernobyl is just a figment of my imagination, much more so than the idea that Walmart would start doubling its pay if the government didn't give subsidies.
In other
Skyler.
words, France, which has powered itself for decades on nuclear power, is a worse example of nuclear power than a poorly constructed Russian atomic facility. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which also doesn't make a whole lot of sense as to why your guy's in bed with them, right?
With whom?
Russians.
Oh, Trump's in bed with Russia?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, that's
tack Chernobyl onto the
list. He was in
list.
bed with Stormy
I don't know. I don't know what
Right
happened. Yeah, well, that too. Listen, he's in bed with a lot of people, and he's having the ladies, piss in the formica and videotaping it. My point is, listen. I mean, right now we're talking. I thought you guys were the party of Red Dawn, right? I thought we were talking about capitalism, but all of a sudden, you're buddy with the Chernobyl guys, Russia. How do you explain that one?
Well, a couple things. One, I'm not sure when the left decided that they were anti-Russian. That's been funny since Barack Obama pledged flexibility in 2012, did nothing when they invaded Ukraine and Crimea, did nothing when they...
Those guys are dicks.
In Syria. Yeah, so there's that. And then, as far as the actual policy, listen, President Trump's rhetoric on Russia is not good. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm not a defender of President Trump on his rhetoric with regard to Vladimir Putin. I've thought that it's awful throughout. But his activity with regard to Russia has been significantly harder on Russia than anything the Obama administration remotely approached.
So you seem to discuss economics a lot. We just talked about resources. So let's not talk about nuclear right away, right? Or nuclear, as your previous iteration called it. That's always a good sign when someone can go to Yale and come out and not pronounce the most basic of words. Maybe you knew some people who spent time with them at Harvard. I don't know. So let's take that off of the table here. Even if we're talking about natural gas, if we're talking about coal, any of these, it still is a finite resource, right? Capitalism does not have there's no moral imperative to move to something that's renewable. If something that is a more toxic alternative, let's not say horrible for the environment. Let's go with what you say, right? And say, okay, fracking's better than the typical kind of extraction methods for. All right, listen, let's give you that. It's still a finite resource. There's no profit motive to move to something more healthful for the environment until it runs out.
Well, I mean, there has been a profit motive to move to more helpful technologies for the environment, considering the significantly higher gas mileage that we get now than we used to in the 1970s. So what was the profit motive there? Presumably, it
government
was generating more
subsidies,
efficient vehicles that use less fuel.
No, it's government subsidies. The same thing that the conservatives, the alt-right, they complain about Tesla, government subsidies. The government stepped in and offered incentives for more fuel-efficient cars. That's why.
It was not mere subsidies alone. It was also the fact that there was high demand as oil prices rose for smaller vehicles. When oil prices go down, there's less demand for smaller vehicles. When oil prices go up, there's more demand for smaller vehicles. Also, the left has been complaining about the idea of peak oil for some decades now, and we've not yet reached peak oil. Plus, with regard to technological development, would I love to see whoever cracks the code on renewable cheap energy is going to make more money than anyone in the history of humankind. The big problem here is that solar is simply not capable of generating the amounts of energy necessary to power entire civilizations. And carbon-based fuel is the most efficient source of energy.
Hold on a second. Ring, ring. Angela Merkel. Oh, it's for you. She says that's bullshit.
Okay, so, all right. I've
Germany, bro. They've been using solar and wind for years. They moved their entire energy dependence to renewable resources.
Well, Germany is taking enormous amounts of actual gasoline and natural gas from Iran, so that's not completely true.
They've converted all of their energy, all of their national energy to solar or wind. Germany. I mean, isn't that a good I mean, I took government intervention, right? I know it's not the military. I know it's not the police force, right? We're on board with that. But
I'll be honest with you. I'll be honest with you, Mr. Turden. I don't know that much about the German energy situation, so I will have to check that out and get back to you.
Oh, shocker. Yeah, shocker. Benjamin Shapiro avoids learning about Germany and their current affairs. Let me ask you, Benjamin, here before we go. I know you're a busy man. In today's day and age, the person who screams the loudest and is most hyperbolic, I get it. is more popular, so I know you have a platform, you have a lot to do. What closing thoughts would you have for the audience? I want to make sure that I understand. You would privatize all schools, K through 12, colleges, not offer welfare, EBT to the poorest among us, not want us to convert to renewable energy, and you're okay with the 1% getting richer while the poor stagnate. I want to make sure they have...
Excellent synopsis. Excellent synopsis. By the way, I would mention, just from a quick Google search here, that the share of renewable electricity in Germany represents, as of 2017, about 35% of their total consumption. So the idea they've converted entirely to solar and wind is just not true.
Well, yeah, I don't know what you're bringing up. It's probably right, your own daily caller link. So after this, we can go back and check it out. But I know that they actually had it as a national order to make sure they move entirely to renewable. Check your source. But is there anything that you would? I want to make sure that I understand it. If I've gotten anything incorrect for the audience, because they'll make up their own mind.
We should privatize everything as much as humanly possible. We should devolve authority to the local level. We should ensure that people have the freedom to use their labor as they see fit and keep their property as they see fit. And we should also have a thriving social capital. We should also have a thriving non-governmental belief in one another. That's the other part of this that is required. It's not just pure libertarianism and free markets. You actually do have to have a virtuous people that is crafted by a civilization steeped in the idea of right and wrong. Pure capitalism alone is better than pure communism and pure socialism alone. A virtuous people is necessary, however, for freedom to truly coexist with a thriving and virtuous society. So that's the other part that we never talk about, but I think that it's sort of important to note.
Would you like to talk about that? You want to grab a couple minutes to talk about that? I want to make sure. Hold on a second, because I know you were. I'm not going by cue cards here. I'm going by, right, the old noggin. But I want to make sure. Hold on. Let me look this up. Yeah, hold on. Virtuous in alt-right speak is a synonym for white. But let me allow you to make that point.
Yeah, good. Mm-hmm.
So you said you want to discuss this. It's necessary. What do you mean by virtuous? Because maybe that makes all of us make sense. Just let's wave the virtuous wand, right?
Well, again, you mentioned at the very beginning of this interview, actually, the idea that the Bible mandates that people give charity. I agree with the basic idea that as John Adams put it, our Constitution is fit only for a moral and religious people, meaning that you need people who are committed to the idea of helping one another outside of government, or people are going to do as you have done and call for an increase of government to fill every life gap. There are certain areas of socialism that are destined to fall down almost immediately. There are other areas of socialism that are destined to fall down over time, but it remains an attractive solution to folks who refuse to acknowledge that there is social network and that there's a social safety net and a social network existing outside of government alone. If you believe that government is the only guarantor of fairness, you are going to end up in the socialist camp. If you believe that community is the chief guarantor of a hand up and that forming thriving social bonds is the necessary adjunct to a free society, then you're going to be more in favor of individual freedom.
Yeah, I don't know that I agree with that, but I appreciate that you bolstered your claim by quoting old dead white guys. I notice that's a real constant, and I think that's going to be doing your party wonders in the midterms in future elections. So it seems like, okay, as long as everyone's a moral person, then fine. This whole capitalism thing will all work out. Just bide your time. Everybody else.
Not everybody has to be a moral person, but you do have to have enough moral people in a society to help fill in the gaps where capitalism does not solve problems for everybody: widows, orphans, people who can't take care of themselves.
Okay, so capitalism would work if people are moral. It just hasn't been done right. It just hasn't been done correctly yet.
No. Assuming that people are immoral. Assuming people are immoral. Capitalism works better than any other system in the history of planet Earth. Assuming that people are moral, capitalism still works better than any system in the history of planet Earth. If you actually want the best of all available systems, what you need is capitalism combined with a moral and virtuous people.
Oh man, it's just my neck is sore from the rigidity. You're so rigid. Capitalism or all socialism. No one's talking about Venezuela. You go to Venezuela, you don't go back to Denmark and Sweden and Norway, right? We're talking about a blended economy, as many of the successful economies are out there that are not called the United States of America, between socialism and capitalism, and we already have that here in the United States. The conversation really comes down to what degree. You draw the line at roads and military and the police force industrial complex. I say, let's toss education and healthcare into the mix. But let's let the rest of people decide. Benjamin Shapiro, it's the Benjamin Shapiro program, if I'm not mistaken. Did I miss anything? Are you good, bro?
That's where it is, man. Go for it.
All right, and I'm sure you've got a lot to do. I'm sure you've got some people to harass there in a college campus and then
Correct.
make a viral video out of it. This has been Devil's Advocate with Skyler Turden. I hope it's been illuminating for everyone out there. And I think next time, I don't know who we have on next time exactly, but I think we'll be discussing feminism and rape culture. But right now I need to take a hot bath.